A raging storm, a desperate cry in the jungle, a baby gorilla lifeless in its mother's trembling arms, and a father roaring into the heavens as thunder split the sky. Just when all hope seemed lost, a lone ranger stepped out of the rain unarmed, kneeling before giants with nothing but courage and faith. What happened next would defy every law of nature, a miracle so powerful, it changed the way the world saw compassion itself. Stay with us because this is not just a story about survival. It's a story about the moment humanity and the wild became one. The sky over Bwindi impenetrable forest turned black long before dusk. The air thickened with electricity the way it does before nature unleashes her fury. The first drop of rain struck the leaves like a warning. Then came another and another until the forest was swallowed by a torrential downpour. Branches snapped, streams overflowed, and animals vanished into the green shadows. To Ranger Ethan Cole, it was supposed to be just another patrol routine, predictable. But that storm would change everything he thought he knew about the wild. Ethan had been stationed in this Ugandan forest for nearly a decade. He'd seen droughts, floods, even poachers at their worst, but nothing prepared him for the sound that reached him through the rain that afternoon. It was not thunder. It wasn't even the low growl of a territorial beast. It was something far more haunting, a deep, trembling roar that cracked halfway through, collapsing into what could only be described as a sob. He froze. Gorillas didn't cry. They fought, they roared, they survived, but they did not weep. Gripping his radio, Ethan tried to call it in, but the static drowned his words. He began moving toward the sound, every step sinking deeper into the slick mud. The rain blurred the world into shifting shapes of gray and green. Another roar echoed closer, this time. It shook his chest, vibrating through his bones, primal and heart-wrenching. The kind of sound only a parent makes when something sacred has been torn away. Ethan pushed through a curtain of vines, his boots sliding on wet roots until the forest opened into a small clearing by a swollen stream. And then he saw it. A massive silverback gorilla, its dark fur plastered to its body by the rain, was kneeling in the mud. In its arms lay a small, limp body, a baby gorilla, lifeless and still. Beside them, a female crouched low, rocking back and forth, her chest heaving with silent sobs. For a moment, Ethan forgot to breathe. The scene before him defied everything he'd ever learned about nature's laws. The father's roars weren't of rage, they were grief itself made flesh, echoing off the trees like thunder mourning the dead. The mother's trembling hand stroked her baby's tiny face again and again, trying in vain to coax life back into its body. The rain poured harder, washing over them all, as if the sky itself grieved with them. Ethan's instinct screamed at him to stay back. A mourning gorilla was unpredictable, dangerous. One wrong move could trigger an attack. Yet something stronger pulled him forward, something deeper than fear. He dropped his pack, raised his empty hands, and took one slow step into the clearing. The silverback's head snapped up. Their eyes met. In those amber eyes, Ethan didn't see savagery. He saw despair, raw, unguarded, almost human. The gorilla's breathing quickened, its chest rising like a storm wave ready to crash. Ethan froze, drenched and trembling, his heart pounding louder than the rain. He spoke softly, barely above a whisper. "It's okay," he said, his voice breaking through the storm. "I won't hurt you." The silverback growled low, a sound that rumbled like distant thunder, but didn't advance. The female looked up too, her gaze flicking between the man and her baby. Ethan took another cautious step, the mud sucking at his boots. "Let me help," he pleaded, his words almost lost in the rain. "Please." The forest seemed to hold its breath. For one impossible second, the storm paused. The gorilla looked down at its child, then back at Ethan. Its massive shoulders quivered, its breath rasping in exhaustion. Ethan's heart ached at the sight. This was not a beast, it was a father losing what he could not protect. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the three of them in a stark flash, the man, the monster, and the tiny body between them. And in that instant, Ethan understood this was no ordinary moment in the wild. It was a cry for life itself, and he was standing at the edge of a miracle or a tragedy. The rain had softened to a steady curtain, but the world still felt heavy, drenched in grief. Ethan knelt in the mud, his breath shallow, watching the small gorilla's body lie motionless in its mother's trembling arms. Nuru's eyes were wide and dark, glistening with confusion and sorrow, as if she couldn't understand why the tiny chest against her heart no longer rose and fell. Her soft moans carried through the forest, weaving with the rhythm of the rain. Beside her, Kano remained still, his great chest heaving with restrained pain, his knuckles buried deep in the soaked earth. He was the embodiment of strength, and yet in this moment, he was broken. Ethan had seen death before. He'd witnessed animals fall to poachers, floods, and famine, but never like this. Never so intimate, never so unbearably human. Something inside him ached in a way he couldn't explain. He had no right to interfere in nature's design, and yet he couldn't just stand there. Life, any life, was worth the attempt. He had been trained to save what could be saved, and in that moment under the torrential sky, that instinct became his only truth. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "Let me help," he whispered softly, not sure who he was speaking to, the gorillas or the heavens. Kano's gaze lifted, fierce and full of warning. His body shifted slightly, muscles rippling beneath the rain-soaked fur. Ethan didn't flinch. He met the silverback's eyes, feeling the raw power of the wild pressing against him. But behind that power, he saw something else: fear. Not of him, but of losing everything. Slowly, deliberately, Ethan knelt lower, lowering his head in a gesture of humility. His hands remained open, empty, vulnerable. The rain fell harder, streaming from his hair, his sleeves pulling around his knees. "I don't want to hurt him," he murmured. "Please, just let me try." The clearing fell silent, except for the sound of rain striking leaves. Nuru's breath came in shaky whimpers as she looked from her child to Ethan. Her body trembled, torn between instinct and desperation. Then, almost imperceptibly, she loosened her hold, laying the baby gently on the wet ground between them. Her hands lingered for a moment, caressing the tiny arm before retreating just a few inches. Ethan's throat tightened. That small act, an act of trust, felt like the most profound thing he had ever witnessed. He moved closer, his heart hammering, and placed two trembling fingers on the baby's chest. Nothing. The skin was cold, the heartbeat absent. He could feel the weight of the silverback's gaze burning into his back each second, a test of his intentions. "Come on, little one," Ethan whispered. "Don't leave them." He interlocked his fingers and began chest compressions, his hands shaking from adrenaline. 1, 2, 3. He counted under his breath, his voice barely audible above the rain. The baby's small frame barely moved with each push. He tilted the head gently, clearing the mouth of water, then leaned down and exhaled softly, his breath mingling with the storm. "Nothing. Please," he begged quietly. "Please breathe." He repeated the motion, pressing, breathing, pressing again. His pulse thundered in his ears and his arms began to ache. But he didn't stop. Nuru's cries had faded into a trembling silence, her eyes locked on the fragile body that held her entire world. Kano shifted his weight, releasing a low rumble, deep and vibrating through the ground, a warning or perhaps a prayer. Ethan's voice broke as he whispered, "Don't give up." He pressed again and again, refusing to surrender to the silence. The air around him seemed to still. The rain slowed. Even the thunder had faded into the distance. The entire forest was listening. Then it happened, a twitch, so faint he almost missed it. Ethan froze, his eyes widening. He pressed again, gently this time, and then a soft gasp escaped the tiny mouth. Water trickled from the baby's lips, followed by the smallest, weakest cough. Ethan choked back a cry of relief. "That's it," he whispered, his voice trembling. "That's it, breathe." The baby coughed again, a rasping sound that broke through the tension like a ray of light through clouds. Nuru let out a cry that shook the clearing, a sound so full of love and disbelief that Ethan felt his heart crack. She reached out, scooping her baby into her arms, holding him close, pressing her face into his tiny chest as if to feel his heartbeat for herself. Kano lifted his head to the sky and released a roar that shook the very air, a sound not of anger, but of victory, of life reclaimed. It echoed through the forest, rolling with the thunder, a declaration to the world that his family had survived. Ethan sat back in the mud, drenched and shaking his hands, still hovering in disbelief. Tears blurred his vision. He wasn't sure if they were his or just rain. He watched as Nuru cradled her child, rocking him gently, her massive shoulders trembling with joy. The baby's small fingers twitched, clutching weakly at her fur, a fragile connection between life and love reborn. Kano turned his gaze toward Ethan. Their eyes met, and for a moment time ceased to exist. The giant's chest rose and fell slowly, his expression unreadable. Then he gave a single nod, a movement subtle but deliberate, a thank you, a recognition. Ethan exhaled, his body trembling, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The forest around them began to breathe again. The rain softened, the leaves rustled, a bird called out in the distance. Life in all its chaos and beauty had returned. He had seen something extraordinary that day, not just a rescue, but the breaking of barriers. Grief had turned to trust. Fear had become faith. And in the heart of a storm beneath the unending rain, a man and two gorillas had proven that compassion transcends species. Ethan looked at them, at Nuru's gentle hands, at Kano's quiet strength, at the fragile breath of the baby, and realized that for all the years he had spent protecting wildlife, it was the wild that had just taught him the truest form of humanity. For a long moment after the baby's faint cry filled the clearing, no one moved. The storm still whispered above, rain dripping from the canopy in silver threads, but time itself seemed to hold its breath. Ethan stayed frozen mud, clinging to his knees, afraid that the slightest motion might break the fragile thread of life that had just returned. Nuru clutched her baby against her chest, her body rocking instinctively, her face buried in the tiny patch of fur that still trembled with breath. Kano stood over them both, his massive frame shivering, a sound caught deep in his throat, a rumble somewhere between awe and disbelief. Ethan didn't dare speak. His own breathing was uneven, the adrenaline still burning through his veins. He had been a ranger for over a decade, had faced lions, poachers, and flash floods, but never anything like this. He felt small in that moment, not as a protector of the wild, but as a witness to something sacred. Yet beneath the reverence, fear still crept through him. He was kneeling less than 3 meters from a silverback gorilla who had every reason to see him as a threat. Kano's head turned slowly toward him. The golden eyes that had once glared with fury now watched him with unblinking intensity. Ethan could hear the sound of his own heartbeat, fast and irregular. The gorilla's chest rose and fell in deep, deliberate breaths. Every muscle was coiled, not aggressive, but on edge like a bowstring, drawn and waiting. Ethan knew that one sudden movement, one misplaced glance could reignite the beast's instinct to protect. He kept his posture low, his hands open, his voice calm, even as his pulse screamed. "It's all right," he whispered, more to the air than to anyone listening. "He's alive. He's okay." Nuru looked up from her child at the sound of his voice. Her eyes were softer now, but her body remained tense, torn between gratitude and primal caution. She pressed her baby closer, as if afraid that any breeze or human could steal him away again. The small gorilla whimpered weakly, shifting against her chest, and the sound broke the tension like sunlight through storm clouds. Kano's gaze shifted downward. He crouched beside Nuru, his enormous hand brushing lightly against his child's back. His fingers were trembling. Ethan watched in silence as the silverback leaned close, sniffing his son's fur, as though memorizing the scent of life itself. Then slowly he lifted his head toward the man who had intervened. For a second their eyes met again. Ethan couldn't explain it, but in that silent exchange something changed. The air between man and beast, once thick with fear, seemed to thin, filled now with something unspoken, understanding. And yet the ranger's body refused to relax. Every instinct screamed at him to back away, to leave, while he still could. But something deeper rooted him in place, a quiet pull that told him leaving now would break the fragile bridge built between them. Lightning flickered in the distance, followed by a low growl of thunder. The sound made Kano's muscles tense again. He looked toward the forest edge, alert, protective. Ethan followed his gaze and realized that the storm had brought the jungle to life in dangerous ways. The distant calls of other animals echoed through the trees, unsettled, wary. The smell of wet soil mixed with something faintly metallic in the air. Kano rose to his full height, towering above them all. His broad shoulders glistened under the rain, every muscle carved in motion. He gave a deep grunt to Nuru, who responded by drawing the baby tighter and edging toward the base of a large fig tree for shelter. Ethan understood immediately Kano was anticipating danger. Something was out there. Ethan's pulse spiked. He slowly turned, scanning the wall of green that surrounded them. The rain-muffled sounds made direction impossible to judge. A twig snapped somewhere behind him. He froze. The noise was faint but deliberate. His training kicked in. Poachers, wild predators. His hand instinctively brushed the small first aid pouch at his belt, the only thing he had carried after dropping his pack. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to breathe quietly. Kano's head turned toward the sound too. The silverback's expression shifted, calm, replaced by raw vigilance. He took a single step forward, placing himself between his family and the noise. The forest fell deathly still. For a few suffocating seconds, the only sound was rain hitting leaves. Then came the movement, a shadow slipping between trees. Ethan caught a glimpse of it, sleek, low to the ground, feline. A leopard. The big cat emerged from the foliage, drawn by the scent of weakness, by the faint whimper of the baby. Its golden eyes locked onto the small family. Ethan's stomach dropped. Leopards rarely risked confronting silverbacks, but desperation during storms made predators reckless. This one looked hungry, its ribs faintly visible through wet fur. Kano stepped forward, releasing a roar so deep it rattled the air. The sound reverberated through the clearing, a wall of power. The leopard froze but didn't retreat. It took another step, cautious but determined. Ethan's instincts screamed to run, but he knew he couldn't. If he bolted, he would draw the predator's attention or trigger Kano's defensive fury. His every breath was deliberate. Stay still. Don't interfere. Trust nature. Kano's second roar shattered the air. It wasn't just sound. It was fury made physical. The leopard hesitated, tail twitching, calculating. Then in a blur of motion, it lunged only to be met mid-air by Kano's full weight. The impact shook the ground. The forest exploded with sound snarls, roars, the crack of branches. Ethan shielded his face from flying mud. It was a battle of instinct and strength, raw and primal. For endless seconds, the two creatures rolled in chaos until at last the leopard tore free and vanished into the darkness, leaving behind nothing but the echo of its retreat. Silence fell again. Kano stood panting, his chest heaving, blood dripping from a shallow gash across his arm. Nuru pressed closer to him, the baby still safe in her grasp. Ethan exhaled a trembling breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. For a long time, no one moved. The storm had finally eased, replaced by the rhythmic dripping of water from the leaves. Ethan watched as Kano turned, his expression unreadable, and met his eyes once more. The tension that had ruled the clearing dissolved, slowly replaced by a quiet, shared respect. Ethan bowed his head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement. He had come to the forest to protect life, but here under the canopy of the wild, he had discovered something even greater: faith. Not just his own, but faith born from fear, shared between two fathers of different worlds. And for the first time since the storm began, Ethan felt the faint but undeniable warmth of hope. When dawn finally came, it arrived shyly, filtered through the dripping canopy, like the soft breath of forgiveness after a night of chaos. The storm had passed, leaving the jungle washed clean, reborn in the pale gold of early light. Mist rose from the soaked ground, curling like ghosts among the trees. The air was cool and sweet, carrying the scent of wet earth and renewal. And in the center of it all, beneath a towering fig tree, life stirred quietly. Ethan awoke to the faint sound of rustling leaves and soft grunts nearby. His body ached, every muscle protesting after the night's ordeal, but his mind was clear, sharper than it had been in hours. The memories came back slowly: the storm, the rescue, the desperate fight for breath, the leopard's attack, and then the miracle. He pushed himself up from the damp ground, wincing as mud clung to his arms. A few meters away, Kano sat upright, his massive frame illuminated by a shaft of morning sunlight. His fur glistened in shades of silver and gold, steam rising from his body in the cool air. Beside him, Nuru held her baby close, the tiny gorilla nestled safely against her chest. The infant's breathing was shallow but steady now, each rise and fall of his chest a quiet victory. The sight stole the air from Ethan's lungs. He had seen many mornings in the wild, but never one that felt this sacred. Nuru looked up at him. Her eyes, so dark, so deeply alive, met his with a softness that made his throat tighten. There was no fear there, now no tension, only calm. The child stirred faintly, making a tiny noise, and Nuru lowered her head to nuzzle him. Ethan smiled despite himself. "You made it, little one," he whispered under his breath. The jungle had changed its tone. Where there had been violence and thunder, there was now birdsong, hesitant at first, then swelling into a chorus that echoed through the valley. Sunlight scattered through the leaves, touching everything with gold. Even the puddles around them seemed to shimmer as if the earth itself was celebrating survival. Ethan ran his hands over his face, feeling the grit and exhaustion give way to awe. He watched as Kano moved closer to his mate, placing a gentle hand on Nuru's back. The gesture was so human, so tender, that Ethan felt something shift deep within him. These weren't just wild creatures surviving instinctively. They were a family bound by the same fierce love and devotion that defined any human home. He realized that what he had witnessed wasn't just nature's resilience. It was nature's compassion. Slowly, Ethan reached into his soaked jacket and retrieved the small camera he carried for field documentation. Its casing was scratched, the lens fogged, but somehow it still worked. He hesitated for a moment. Taking photos felt almost intrusive after what he'd been part of, but then he remembered his duty. This wasn't just a moment for him, it was something the world needed to see. The proof that life, even in its wildest forms, could defy the boundaries we thought existed. He lifted the camera carefully, aiming through the mist. The lens captured Nuru's arms around her child Kano's protective stance beside them, and the soft dawn light wrapping them all in warmth. Ethan pressed the shutter, and the faint click echoed softly through the clearing. He took another and another, each frame a testament to what hope looked like when it refused to die. Kano's head turned at the sound. His eyes met Ethan's once again, and for a fleeting second the ranger feared he had overstepped. But instead of aggression, he saw calm recognition. The gorilla blinked slowly, then turned his gaze back to his family as if granting silent permission. It was a moment beyond understanding, a mutual acknowledgement between two beings from opposite worlds who had shared something beyond words. Ethan lowered the camera and just sat there for a while, letting the silence speak. The forest buzzed faintly with a renewed hum of life, the drip of water from leaves, the distant chatter of monkeys, the whisper of wind moving through branches. The night's chaos already felt like a distant memory, though the ground still bore its scars: mudslides, broken branches, paw prints mixed with human footprints. The jungle, like them all, was healing. Hours passed and the sun climbed higher. When Ethan finally rose to his feet, his legs stiff and unsteady, Kano followed him with his gaze. There was no hostility now, only watchfulness. Ethan understood it as the look of a father protecting what he loved. He nodded once, a gesture of farewell, and began to step backwards slowly, his boots sinking into the wet earth. He didn't turn his back until he was several meters away. From that distance, he looked one last time. Nuru was grooming her child, her movements gentle and rhythmic, while Kano sat nearby, scanning the horizon, always alert, always guarding. The light fell perfectly on them, turning the clearing into something almost divine. Ethan knew he would never forget it. When he finally reached the forest's edge, he paused and took one deep breath of the clean, rain-washed air. His heart was full, heavy with fatigue, but lighter than it had been in years. He felt changed in a way that words couldn't explain. The line between man and animal, between protector and protected, had blurred forever. He thought of the baby's heartbeat returning under his fingers, of Nuru's tearful cry, of Kano's thunderous roar, echoing not in rage but in gratitude. He thought of the silence that followed, the silence of peace. As he began the long walk back to the ranger station, the sun broke fully through the canopy, flooding the jungle in gold. He smiled faintly. The miracle he had witnessed didn't just belong to the animals, it belonged to life itself. To every soul that ever refused to surrender, no matter how impossible the storm seemed. And though Ethan would never see that family again, he knew that somewhere beneath the same endless sky, a silverback still watched over his world, and a tiny heartbeat still kept rhythm with the pulse of the earth. Days passed, and the jungle returned to its familiar rhythm, yet something within it had changed, something invisible, but profoundly real. Ethan could still feel it in the air, in the way the forest seemed to breathe differently. The storm had washed away more than debris. It had cleansed the thin barrier that separated the wild from the human heart. Somewhere deep inside, the ranger knew he would never be the same again. Back at the conservation station, his colleagues listened in stunned silence as he recounted what had happened. No one spoke for a long time. When he finished, the story defied logic: how a ranger had knelt before two grieving gorillas, how life had returned in the middle of a storm, and how a bond had formed where fear once ruled. Yet every word he spoke carried the unmistakable weight of truth. Ethan's voice wavered only when he described the baby's first gasp, the moment when hope had exhaled into the world again. In the following days, Ethan returned to the jungle often, though he kept his distance. He never saw the gorilla family up close again, but he felt their presence. Tracks near the old fig tree, the faint rustle of movement in the distance, and the echo of a familiar low rumble carried through the trees whenever he passed. It was enough. He knew they remembered him just as he would never forget them. Each time he walked beneath the canopy, the world felt softer alive in ways he had never noticed before. He found himself pausing to watch ants rebuild their paths after the flood, to listen to the slow rhythm of dripping water, to marvel at how everything in the jungle was both fragile and indestructible. He began to understand that the wilderness wasn't separate from humanity, it was a mirror of it. Every struggle, every heartbeat, every instinct to protect and endure was shared between them. Ethan often thought about that night, the helplessness, the fear, the miracle. It was no longer just a story of saving a life. It was a lesson in humility. He realized that the gorillas had taught him something far greater than survival. They had shown him trust without words, gratitude without expectation, and love without boundaries. In their silence, they had spoken the purest truth he had ever known, that compassion is the bridge between worlds. Months later, his photograph of Nuru holding her baby beneath the dawnlight spread across the globe. It appeared in conservation journals, news broadcasts, and humanitarian campaigns. People wept when they saw it. They didn't see just animals in that frame, they saw themselves. They saw hope. Letters flooded the station from every corner of the world. People wrote about how the story had changed them, reminded them that kindness isn't weakness, and that even in the harshest moments, the instinct to care is what makes life sacred. Ethan never sought recognition, but he accepted the attention only because it gave him a platform to speak for the voiceless. He stood before audiences, scientists, students, ordinary people, and told them that saving wildlife wasn't about control or conquest. It was about coexistence, about learning that the wild doesn't need to be tamed, it needs to be understood, respected, and protected as the living soul of this planet. Sometimes late at night, he would return to the edge of the forest and listen. And once on a quiet evening, when the air was thick with the scent of rain, he heard it again, a low, familiar rumble rolling through the trees like a heartbeat. It wasn't loud, but it reached him all the same. A message, a memory, a thank you. He smiled through the darkness. That sound wasn't just the voice of a gorilla. It was the voice of the earth itself, reminding him that humanity and nature were never truly separate. They were two halves of the same whole, breathing together in the same fragile rhythm. From that day forward, Ethan carried that truth with him everywhere he went. He walked lighter, spoke softer, and lived with a reverence he hadn't known before. The wild had not only trusted him with a life, it had trusted him with a lesson, one that whispered quietly through the leaves every time the wind passed through. Protect what you love, cherish what you share, and never forget that hope is the heartbeat of the world. In the end, the story of Ethan and the gorilla family was not just about survival. It was about rediscovering what it means to be alive. Beneath the canopy of that wild, rain-soaked jungle, a ranger and two grieving parents found something the modern world often forgets: the quiet, unspoken truth that love and compassion are not human inventions, they are the oldest instincts on Earth. That morning, when a tiny heartbeat returned to life, the world witnessed a miracle not created by science or luck, but by courage, empathy, and the refusal to surrender hope. Ethan's act of bravery did more than save a life. It reminded us that the line dividing humanity and nature is an illusion. We are not rulers of the wild, we are part of it. The same heartbeat that thunders in the chest of a gorilla beats within us. The same desperation that drives a mother to save her child exists in every species that calls this planet home. When Ethan knelt in the mud, risking everything to breathe life back into a creature so different from himself, he showed us that compassion is the only true language the world will ever need. The message of this story is one that goes beyond the jungle. It is a call to remember that kindness is strength, that empathy is our greatest weapon against indifference, and that the bond between all living things is what gives meaning to existence. We are all caretakers of each other, of the earth, and of the fragile beauty that connects us. The storm that night destroyed much, but it also gave birth to something eternal: faith. Faith that no matter how dark the world becomes, there will always be light in those who choose to care. As Ethan walked away from that sacred place, he didn't just leave behind a miracle. He carried with him a truth that every one of us must remember, that even in the wildest heartbeats of chaos, humanity and nature are one. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that hope still lives in the most unexpected places, then help us share that message with the world. Hit that subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and join our growing community of people who believe in compassion, courage, and the power of love that transcends species. Because every time you share a story like this, you help keep that heartbeat of hope alive.